Given how fluid the tariff situation is, please note that some details of the interpretation of the tariff rules may have evolved since this podcast was recorded. Hello, everyone. Welcome to BWS Dialogues, the podcast from Brandwidth Solutions. I'm Laura Bush, the Senior Director of Content Marketing here at Brandwidth. Today, I have the pleasure of talking to Gil Roth, the President of PBOA, the Pharma and Biopharma Outsourcing Association. Gil founded PBOA in 2014 to advocate for the regulatory, legislative, and business interests of the CDMO sector. Gil, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
So today we're going to talk about the new pharmaceutical tariffs that were announced on April 2nd. Tariffs will go into effect on July 31st for the 17 largest pharma companies and on September 29th for everyone else. And the tariffs are set at 100%, but generics are exempted, and there are various other exemptions and some lower rates, which we will discuss. So Gil, many folks have a sense of whiplash from all the tariff changes over the last year. These new tariffs were imposed under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which allows the president to charge duties if a Department of Commerce investigation shows that imports impair national security. Is it believed that these pharmaceutical tariffs, which were announced under Section 232, will hold up in court?
Yeah, unlike the tariffs that were announced initially on the Liberation Day of April 2nd, 2025, these actually have their statutory language, a congressional mandate, and an actual pathway and precedent for them to be implemented. Under those previous tariffs, which were instituted under the Economic Emergency Powers Act, that had never been used to implement tariffs previously, and that's what led to a big Supreme Court challenge, and ultimately those tariffs were struck down. Section 232 tariffs, as a result of Section 232 national security probes, do have a precedent and a history and can be implemented, although they also require congressional interaction, reporting out to Congress subsequent to actually implementing them. So there's a bit more, we'll say, oversight, although that's a term that doesn't get used too much in this administration.
In the newly announced pharma tariffs, generic drugs are exempted, as I mentioned, but there are also exemptions for several categories of innovator drugs, such as orphan drugs and antibody drug conjugates. Those categories seem kind of broad, but the wording is a bit unclear. Have you gotten clarification on that?
Well, there's a whole series of nested exemptions and clarifications to be had within the Section 232 announcement. First and foremost, generics are exempted for the first year and will be reviewed subsequently. Further, the tariffs that were announced also are not, those tariffs don't go into effect with countries or regions with which the U.S. has established a trade agreement. So anything coming out of the EU is maxed at 15% as opposed to the 100% that was initially there. UK technically goes down to zero if the framework they agreed to gets implemented. So a number of countries and regions these tariffs would not apply to anyway. However, some of the regions that do not have those agreements include India and China, as well as Canada, although that's still covered within the USMCA, which is under duress and under renegotiation at some point later this year. So the exemptions do exist. Those would be for, again, certain classes of drugs that are coming from countries with which we do not have a trade agreement. If you do have a trade agreement with them, those categories go to zero instead of the 15% or other tariffs that were negotiated between the U.S. and those countries. The application process to get to zero seems to be on a case-by-case basis. At least from the wording in the White House's proclamation, the companies with these sorts of products would have to apply to the Department of Commerce individually to make sure that they're at a zero tariff rate. Now, the two qualifications to get to zero are either that you come from one of those countries with which there's an agreement, or there is a quote unquote urgent United States health need, which goes undefined, and there'll be a Federal Register notice whenever determination is made for any of these particular products. But it sounds like they would need to be applied for. If you, for example, had an ADC coming from India, which does not have a trade agreement yet, you would need to apply to show that it has a U.S. health need and try to get a zero tariff for that. That said, it's better than 100%, and it gives at least a route to try to get to zero.
Right. And a big question there is that we don't know how urgent health need might be defined.
Correct. There's a lot of undefined needs which seem to require um, application, I'll say,
Mhm.
to individual departments, whether it's the Health and Human Services or Commerce Department.
So you mentioned that there are key country exemptions. So the UK is at 10%, and the EU, Switzerland, Japan, and Korea, I thought were at 20%, although you, I think, mentioned that as a 15%.
That's as far as I know, it's 15. Yeah.
Okay. So then that really means that the countries with the biggest impact are China and India. So China's not that surprising because generally China is seen as a security threat for the United States. But why wouldn't India be exempted? Or is that kind of a non-issue because India mostly produces generics, which are already exempted?
There have been difficulties that go way beyond my pay grade as the CMO guy. There have been difficulties with the India-US process of ironing out a trade agreement. I've heard rumors that are, again, way beyond where I am as a CMO that go to the top levels of the Indian government and how they are interacting with the White House in terms of trying to get to an agreement that will work for both parties. So pharma is just captured within all that. And you're correct that a good amount, a very significant amount of the pharma exports from India are in the generic space. However, they are making advances within finished dosage form and as well as higher value innovator products. So it could still impact that space. We have a few members who do significant higher value, we'll say innovator products within India for US and global.
Fascinating. So another big exemption, as you mentioned, are for products made by companies that have entered into most favored nation pricing agreements with the administration. And that now covers all 17 of the top pharma companies. So that seems to indicate to me that the companies really impacted by these tariffs are going to be small and medium-sized companies. Is that right?
That's what it looks like. I, my take, and I talk with some of the license holder side associations about this. The top 17 companies, the 17 companies that the president wrote to last year to try to force most favored nation pricing and other agreements with, they've reached those agreements. I'll say they can afford to make those agreements and commitments. The next 1,700 might not be able to. Now that ties into what the mechanisms of this tariff regime are, and there are two significant levers within it. The first is to establish an onshoring agreement to move products to the U.S. If you do that, then your ex-U.S. products or ingredients will go down to a 20% tariff, which could still escalate to 100%. If you have an onshoring agreement in place and then you have a most favored nation pricing agreement with the US, then your company's products tariffs go down to zero. So those bigger companies can afford to make announcements about significant major domestic capex investments in manufacturing in the US. A lot of smaller companies simply can't. Because they don't do their own manufacturing. They don't have the capital to sink into the ground to make stuff in the US. So satisfying that first step of onshoring would be very difficult for them before, and I think that's based on the language of the proclamation, that is a necessary step before you can get to most favored nation and zero tariff. So trying to figure out what onshoring is going to consist of and how that's going to be implemented by all those smaller companies that simply don't have the capital to make domestic investment is going to be the big challenge going forward and seeing how this is implemented.
What about companies that might be manufacturing drug product in the United States but have imported APIs? Because so they'll be affected by these tariffs, right?
Yeah, and there's a article I read very recently where some smaller biotech was complaining about exactly that. We manufacture in the U.S., but we're still going to get hit with these tariffs, which I have to assume is the value of their APIs. And I'm not sure how that value is going to be assessed when it comes to tariffs? Is it going to be the unit cost of the API by itself, or is it going to be some fraction of the final dosage form cost of the drug? A lot of that stuff is still uncertain, and how that's going to impact sourcing decisions from these smaller biotechs and smaller pharma companies, again, is all part of how implementation is going to roll out for this and seeing what impact that's going to have on sourcing decisions.
And what do you think could be the impact of tariffs on US-based CDMOs, for example, that are manufacturing branded drugs for export, say if other countries retaliate with high tariffs?
We haven't seen a significant pushback. We haven't seen a significant pushback with other countries, and generally, pharma is exempted from a lot of these things. What we're seeing, and it began last year, really began the year before in 2024 with Biosecure when that was first floated. We're seeing more interest in outsourcing to US CDMOs. And that accelerated in 2025, first with those Liberation Day tariffs, and then with the implication that something was coming down the pike. There was certainly more interest in moving products, tech transferring products to the US, potentially in smaller volumes, US for US, while manufacturing in other regions for other regions, as well as foreign CDMOs or ex-US CDMOs looking to acquire US operations. And we've seen a few deals go through in that space, giving those non-US CDMOs a US footprint, potentially to either develop new business or transfer existing customers into US facilities to try to make sure they have domestic manufacturing taking place.
That also leads into something that you were talking about a few minutes ago, which was that the provisions of these tariffs are designed to promote onshoring, as we know, and that part of that is about promoting investments in new infrastructure. And there have been all these announcements of companies declaring that they're breaking new ground and new pharmaceutical facilities. But don't those rules, first of all, risk penalizing companies that already invested in U.S. domestic manufacturing years ago? And then do they take into account using the capacity of domestic CDMOs?
I'll tackle the first question. It's an interesting one if you follow the press releases, as I tend to do. When the initial announcements came out about domestic investments, you saw from Lilly and Johnson, they both announced their $50 and then $55 billion packages, although that was all including existing capex that they'd committed to years earlier. They focused on capex. They focused on, in Lilly's case, $23 billion for 4 facilities that they were going to build in the US. Subsequently, you start reading these press releases, and it wasn't just new operations or new facilities. Some of them turned into continuing operations in the US, R&D spend in the US, capex for improvements to facilities. So it looked as though some of these companies were just trying to frankly pile in as much as they could, the ones who had significant domestic footprint already, just to show how much was being spent in the US as opposed to how much brand new money they were going to apply here. So that was a trend I started to see as these announcements were happening. And another significant one, Regeneron was really the first one to head in this direction. Their initial announcement was $3 billion that consisted, as near as I could tell, solely in a CDMO deal with Fujifilm in North Carolina. That did not announce any new Fujifilm expansion. That was simply, this is our domestic investment in onshoring. We are putting $3 billion into domestic manufacturing in this North Carolina CDMO. Subsequently, they announced billions more for their internal operations in New York. And then very recently, they were the 17th out of 17 companies to settle on an agreement, which coincidentally occurred the day they got accelerated approval for a product under the FDA's new Commissioner National Priority Review Voucher. They announced a total of $29 billion, which would be new facilities, potentially, I assume, this outsourcing agreement, R&D, and continuing operations. Sanofi was another one that announced $20 billion, but within the first paragraph or so said, including work with our external sourcing partners. So They were saying we're going to be putting $20 billion dollars into the US. They were not saying we are going to build $20 billion dollars worth of facilities. And that's really the shift that these announcements took over time, which showed, I think, some of the realities, exactly as you were saying. Some of these companies already had a strong domestic footprint. They did not need to start building more capacity that they were not going to use, but they did need to show a commitment to US operations. So that's sort of where things headed when it came to those major companies announcing these things. With smaller companies, they can't all afford to do this, and so part of what PBOA's argument is, and what I'll be making with the Department of Commerce in a couple of days when we have a call, is that tech transferring to a US CDMO should count as part of your onshoring, exactly as Regeneron's initial announcement implied. Some of these companies are going to move manufacturing here or are going to work with a CDMO in the US, and that should it should suffice as their onshoring commitment goes, because they can't all build here. There isn't enough manufacturing. There isn't enough workforce. There isn't enough construction equipment, the processing equipment, et cetera. And there isn't market demand for some of the products that these companies are making that they can do individually as opposed to sharing within a CDMO operation.
Yeah, exactly. And so do you have any inkling of how receptive they will be to that argument that
None
tech
whatsoever. And
transfer to a
that's
CDMO?
why I'm going to have a call
Yeah.
with them, because I've spoken with Commerce previously, especially when they were working on the Section 232 probe, just to make sure they understood our sector. And it turns out we're hearing about CDMOs from the license holder sector, to make sure exactly that what we were talking about is quote unquote counted, that moving products to a CDMO is domestic investment in a way that the argument I have made to multiple congressional offices as well as federal agencies. CDMOs in general are not going to make expansion announcements in the billions. We did just see one from PBOA member PCI Pharma saying they're going to be putting $1 billion dollars into sterile fill finish and other operations. But for the most part, CDMO investments will be they'll be in the millions. That said, what CDMOs do is a force multiplier. When Lilly announces they're going to spend $5 billion dollars on a facility to make one API for one product, it's meaningful, but that is not they're not creating domestic manufacturing robustness and resilience. What CDMOs do is serving many customers in many different modalities. We can do with much smaller investment, provided we have the regulatory framework and incentives to support us.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Because that capacity then is available for any company that needs it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Especially as we learned during Operation Warp Speed, it happened that Grand River Aseptic Manufacturing was on a expansion curve, as was Catalent in Bloomington, Indiana, and they were able to accommodate Johnson and Johnson and then Moderna's vaccines very well. J&J at no point announced that they were going to be building their own internal capacity to make COVID vaccines. They understood very well this is a huge investment, but something that our CDMO partners can do. And we don't need to be allocating capital to that when we can work with these companies as effectively as we can.
Exactly. Exactly. It supports that larger goal of providing that security that we need, of security of supply.
Sure.
So we talked a few minutes ago about the IEEPA tariffs, which were found to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but those did affect some things related to pharma, like processing equipment, components, and other consumables. So now with those tariffs being found unconstitutional, companies are supposed to be able to get their money back. But assuming that they can, is there still a lasting impact of that from the disruption side?
There were companies that held off on CapEx decisions because of the uncertainty of those tariffs. Within a CDMO space, the idea that your processing equipment and other things you were ordering from overseas might cost 50% more than you had allocated for, depending on what day they arrived, because of how mercurial those tariffs were, kept people from making some investments. I think now that that is in the rearview mirror, we still need to go through the harmonized tariff code language that's in the White House's proclamation for Section 232 for pharma supply chains to see what things are exempt and what things aren't. A lot of things that our members would be ordering would come from equipment would come from Europe, and that is, it seems, maxed at 15%. I have to see if any of those are seen as exempted within the HTS codes. It's you know it's a challenge to start exploring another language like that, as I discovered last year when tariffs reared their ugly head, and I had to become a seeming expert in them to be able to explain to our members what was going on. So there are things that apply to particular classes of chemicals and drugs, and there's equipment that's mentioned. It's a question of what things are counted and not counted, what things are tariffed because of both the amount, the content of steel from other regions that is tariffed under a completely different Section 232 probe for steel and aluminum. There are a lot of interlocking segments here that have raised costs when it comes to trying to get equipment for domestic manufacturing, for sure.
Yeah, such a complex industry, as many industries are. And with
Yep.
global trade as it is, these things have impacts that are hard to predict, aren't they?
Yep.
So this is maybe a hard question to answer, but if we take it into consideration, everything that we've been talking about, do you have a sense of what the real impact of these tariffs might be on the industry broadly and on CDMOs specifically?
I think, shorter term, provided the Department of Commerce agrees with our perspective that tech transfer to a domestic CDMO counts, which should see increased volume for domestic CDMOs. Now, there are a whole lot of hang-ups with that. First is the amount of time it takes for tech transfer, which generally is 18 to 24 months to move products from one facility to a new one. The API side is still undetermined. There's within the small molecule space, there just isn't the domestic manufacturing capacity for small molecule APIs here. So depending how much of that stuff you're trying to move domestically, that can take time. And for some of it, there simply is no capacity. You need to find providers in other regions.
Even if we're talking about innovator APIs?
Yeah, I mean, with the innovator side, you'll probably move to the front of the line. There might be specialized technology, though, that you're making certain types of APIs in certain countries. You are just not making them in the U.S. I think particularly within high potency space, where there are environmental and safety considerations, you might find that it is very costly to make them in the US and just to build the supply chain for those. So that's an area to watch out for, certainly. Within the dosage form space, there are a number of different types of dosage forms out there. There's been different degrees of focus on certain areas, oral solid dosage versus sterile fill finish for injectables. With the GLP-1 surge in recent years, sterile injectable capacity has been at a premium in certain areas. Seeing how that levels out, if companies start moving products here, that could cause a supply crunch with oral solid dosage. You could run into the same issue, although generally a lot of the oral solids done in the U.S. are they can be more on the commodity side within the generic space, which is not facing that sort of tariff pressure at this point. The question that overlays all that is, if a whole lot of companies start moving products into the US simultaneously, even if they do have contract agreements in place with CDMOs, how well is the FDA going to be able to review all of these tech transfer processes? Because with some of them, there might be facilities that have handled something similar or something very close. We can waive that. You don't need a pre-approval inspection, et cetera. For some, on the other hand, FDA might need to come in and review a facility, and that can extend the timeline for these tech transfers. How well FDA can handle the resource crunch in that case, at a time that FDA's own resources have been constrained by other actions within the administration, could be a bottleneck when it comes to trying to move a lot of products to the US at the same time.
Yeah, wow. So you touched on that issue of this FDA resources, and that's another really big source of disruption right now in the industry, right? So how much of an impact are you seeing of that disruption of what's been going on at the FDA with the changes in leadership and reduced staffing? Um, and maybe even just sort of if we look at it in the broader context of all the things affecting the industry in terms of disruption. So disruption at the FDA, tariffs, inflation, and most recently the war in Iran. How do you see the industry navigating all that, and particularly your PBOA members?
It's a challenge. Yeah, it could be a little rough. In March, I was asked to give a presentation for pharma contract manufacturing Europe, and they just said, "We'd like you to speak on geopolitics and CDMOs." I said, "Oh, a nice, easy topic. Great." That was a challenge in its way. I'll say from the FDA side of things, the FDA had significant cuts take place about a year ago, April of 2025, as part of the whole Doge idiocy, frankly, of attempting to gut the federal workforce. FDA's been on a hiring binge, they claim, subsequently trying to staff back up and make sure that they're able to actually fulfill the commitments they have to industry, Congress, and other parties. If you look at the workforce web pages for CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and CBER, the biologics version of that, they're not making a ton of progress, frankly. They are in the single digits when it comes to quarterly increases in staff because of the cuts that were made and the ongoing attrition of people leaving the agency. CDER and CBER are not, while the FDA commissioner has talked about hiring 1,000 people and onboarding 400, they're not showing up yet in those publicly reported databases, which cover through the first quarter of 2026. So we'll see how well the agency is able to restaff. The one area that they're trying to improve on is what they're calling shared services, where a lot of different offices they'll contend duplicative staff and redundancy built in, and they're trying to consolidate that into back office functions. So that can be they believe an area where they can find efficiencies, where there might be a net loss in full-time equivalents, but no degradation in service provided. Some of that is like travel services, which individual offices all had. They're trying to consolidate that into one office with a much smaller FTE footprint. The number one issue is how are drug reviews handled? And drug reviews include both in-house reviewers and the inspectors who go out to facilities, and then all the policy related people adjacent to those reviewers who are helping adjudicate what some of the questions are within certain drug applications. Prior to this administration, there had been massive, I don't want to say massive, there's been significant turnover within the inspectorate. Inspectors are, they were leaving during COVID. They were having trouble restaffing and trying to build back up to having a full cadre of inspectors. I have heard anecdotally that the process of training inspectors is a lot looser than it once was. I'll just say, I'll say don't quote me on this only because I don't have any proof or corroboration. I had always heard an inspector took 12 to 18 months of training before they were allowed to inspect a facility on their own. It was recently conveyed to me that that's now 6 weeks of computer training. I don't know if that's true or not. If that is true, you will get inspectors out in the field much quicker. I don't know about the quality and rigor of inspections, nor I'll say not that they would be low quality inspectors, but what you might see is those inspectors citing every observation in a way that an inspector with more training and experience might say, it's an observation, but it's not significant. We'll note it, but we're not going to put this on a big 483 report. A more green inspector might, just to make sure they're covering all bases, cite every single thing they see, which can create the illusion of a more difficult facility or facility with significant problems.
Interesting. So what the scenario you're describing is maybe one where a more experienced inspector might note some of the smaller concerns, maybe verbally to the people he's inspecting and put them on notice that they have to address it, but not write up every single detail.
Correct. And that all creates a backlog for the headquarters. Once the inspection report comes back, that's when it has to be assessed in terms of what is a voluntary, no action indicated, voluntary action indicated, or official action. NAI, VAI, and OAI being the three classifications for these inspections. Those have an impact on the drug applications they're tied to. If it's a pre-approval inspection or if it's a surveillance inspection, it can impact any drugs that are pending or currently approved with that site. So we'll see how the inspector overhaul affects things. Within the drug review side, they contended, the commissioner contended that no reviewers or inspectors were fired during the purges that took place in 2025. That said, they did remove or furlough or offer early retirement to project managers and other people who are above that layer. And again, these are the people who, if two different review disciplines disagreed on a drug application, they could adjudicate what was there. They have to rebuild that expertise. And that is all part of what goes into drug reviews. And this is all beyond the CMO side of things, because we're mainly focused on the facility and the chemistry, manufacturing, and control side of stuff. But it impacts the timeline when FDA is committed to a 10-month review cycle as a standard for NDAs, BLAs, or ANDAs. There are shorter review cycles for various priority reasons, but the longer term effect of that could be complete response letters. They basically have 10 months to issue either a yes or a complete response letter to an application. Complete response letter means industry needs to respond completely to what's there and then resubmit and go through the review cycle again. The possibility that complete response letters might be issued for things that would not have received complete response letters in past years, just so they can say we ruled on this drug, where under previous regimes, they might have been able to either get to a yes within 10 months or take a goal date extension and, try to get to yes much quicker than a full CRL and then subsequent reapplication. Those are things we're concerned about, that you could see what I'll say are ticky-tack complete response letters that are issued so that they can say we're meeting our goal of 90% of applications getting either a yes or a CRL. Getting acted upon is the congressional language for these. So if you start to see more CRLs getting issued, that could potentially lead to CMOs who were expecting to start commercial manufacture of something being told, sorry, it's going to be another 18 months. You need to save our manufacturing spot for then because we're going through a CRL period and need to resubmit everything. In addition, there was the arbitrariness of the previous head of CBER and chief medical officer of the FDA, which led to certain drugs that were in consultation with FDA on the pathway to getting that approval, being told that their applications were no longer approvable, or in some cases, incoming applications were given a refuse to receive. With the departure of that CBER/CMO, we'll see if things change. There are concerns about the politicization of the review process that could, as I mentioned with that commissioner's national priority review voucher, affect drugs either being privileged or being biased against if they're in a particular modality that the administration doesn't want to see reaching the general public. That's pretty broad, I apologize, but there's a whole lot of factors going on within the FDA side of things and the drug application process that, again, stretch way beyond the CMO side of things, but impact us if those products that were moving forward are no longer moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, that could be a huge impact on a CDMO if they've reserved manufacturing capacity for a client anticipating approval and then that gets delayed a year, 2 years longer. That's going to be a major disruption.
Yeah, it's an anecdote I've told in the past. I spoke at a conference in Europe last year, and a European CDMO came up to me and said, we need to join your trade association. We just established a US office. We got to be part of this. I said, what do you guys do? And they said, we manufacture messenger RNA products. And I said, you should close your US office for a couple of years because I suspect there will not be any new mRNA products making it through FDA and HHS under this administration. And I said, I'd rather not take your money and have you find this out after the fact. Just be careful because the Secretary of HHS and a number of the people he's hired subsequently at FDA and in other branches of HHS, like the acting CDC head, seem to have a bias against messenger RNA products. They believe they're unsafe. What that's going to mean for those products that are in development or have not yet been submitted at FDA remains to be seen. But CDMOs who have worked to add those capabilities during COVID onwards might find significant challenges going forward, or they might be manufacturing for non-US markets ahead of US markets. So there are a lot of potential strange impacts like that we need to look for, both in the R&D side and then what it's going to mean for CDMOs who are serving that space.
Wow, the impacts could be staggering.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to take it all in, really.
And then there's tariffs and the war and everything else to deal with too.
Right,
But yeah.
right. So what this is also making me think about, I mean, there's a lot of things going on here, right, that we're talking about, but you also get the sense that there may be some pretty important aspects of drug manufacturing that the current administration or government policy just kind of overlooks and maybe doesn't understand, particularly with regard to CDMOs. Does that feel true to you? And if so, what would you point to?
Well,
What are the
that's
particular things?
Oh, sure. Well, that's the reason PBOA exists. I founded the association in 2014 because of the FDA's generic drug user fees, which impacted the CDMO space in a way that I thought was malicious. But once I got into the room, I discovered was just that nobody knew we existed. They knew we existed, but they didn't understand what CMOs were as a business, who we are, what we do. So that was the initial, we need to educate people about how CDMOs operate. Once I got beyond FDA, it turned into really educating people about the existence of this whole space. And again, we'll mention Operation Warp Speed as something that introduced the concept of CMOs to a lot of people. No one understood before then in the general public that something like Moderna, startup with this incredible technology, been around for years but had no commercial manufacturing capability. They needed Lonza to make the bulk COVID vaccine. They needed Catalent to make the prefilled syringe final dosage form, or the vial version initially, and then move over to syringes. The existence of CMOs is something that people don't think about. And so my whole thing is educating Congress about that, educating individual government agencies about this. I've worked with Department of Defense, State Department, Department of Commerce, getting them to understand that role that we play in terms of, especially from a startup's perspective, empowering those sectors, giving them the ability to develop and advance a drug without having to sink capital into the ground. They can work with CMOs from the ground up and be able to develop and advance a product. Even to the point of, and this is something that's changed, and something I'm keeping an eye on as we move forward. The model, when I started out in 1999, and for the first bunch of years for startups, was you get to phase 2, you sell the compound to a major pharma. By the 2010s, with at least certain types of drugs, startups were holding on to them. They were advancing on their own into phase 3 and even into commercial with the thought that we could get a big payout early based on our potential, or we could actually become a drug company and make a lot of money and build our own pipeline from here and keep going. CDMOs are allowing us to do this. And one thing I discovered late, in that process in the 2010 range, was that a company like Biogen had almost no internal manufacturing of its own. It was, while a commercial drug company with billions of dollars in revenue, was outsourcing much of its manufacturing, both API and dosage form. So that really, I think, made a shift in the 2010s where companies were holding on to their compounds, where they were building up more and becoming smaller drug companies building out. In recent years, and especially in the past year, there's a lot more buyouts happening of phase 1, phase 2 compounds and companies. And I think some of that is large pharma's R&D droughts in some respects. Some of that is these companies deciding, yeah, things are a little uncertain. This whole political environment might affect how we can commercialize our product. Let's just sell it to the company with all the GLP-1 products that has $50 billion sitting around and needs to spend it on something. So I think we're seeing a bit more of, and this is all anecdotal. I'd love to see endpoints or somebody else really dive into this. Uh, More companies selling again, like they did in the 90s into the aughts, where they are proving the concept and moving to a major pharma company more quickly. What that'll mean for CMOs, could be a negative. In some of those instances, the acquiring company will move capacity or move the compound in house. In some cases, though, the CDMO that they've been working with might have expertise or have shown really strong ability with that molecule. They might keep working with the CMO even after they've acquired the company developing the molecule. So we'll see how that develops and how that evolves going forward. I think there's still a strong R&D early stage environment, struggling with all the economic issues that have happened, R&D being impacted by inflation, by the NIH cuts that took place last year, and how those are going to be, whether those will be reinstated or truncated going forward. You could see impacts on the R&D side. I think there's still a healthy enough environment to keep things going for CDMOs that are supporting those early stage companies. It's just a question to me of, will they allow themselves to get beyond phase two, or will they be looking for a more secure buyout early on?
So, going back to the question of the tariffs, the goal is to promote domestic drug manufacturing. I think you've made quite a handful of proposals to support U.S. domestic drug manufacturing. If you could choose only one and get it enacted, what would it be?
Well, we replied to the Section 232 probe last year when it has to be put out for public notice. So we, well, along with 950 other entities, submitted a response to Department of Commerce and Bureau of Industry and Statistics about what we saw. We really were, let's get away from tariffs and move toward incentives, regulatory, financial, and tax code. The number one issue for CDMOs being able to expand, whether it's in the US or elsewhere, has been the catch 22 that CDMOs have that in house pharma does not. For a CDMO building a new operation, whether it's a new line or a new facility, they cannot get inspected by the FDA unless there's a drug application referencing that new line or new operation. But a company is going to be hesitant to work with a CDMO with a new line, a new operation, unless the FDA has been in to inspect it. So they're always caught in this catch 22 where at some point a customer has to be willing to bite the bullet, take the risk, and dive in with a facility that has not been inspected. So finding some way of getting FDA interaction with a CDMO as it's building, as it's planning out a site, as it's operationalizing it, so that they can provide some sort of assurance. Not they literally statutorily cannot inspect a site, but they can say, we have visited this facility, we have investigated its operations and its quality systems, we are providing a GMP certification to say that this is as close to saying it would pass a pre-approval inspection as we can, without telling you it is going to pass a pre-approval inspection, because we can't say it until we've seen a product here. So trying to come up with something like that, which potentially the FDA's pre-check program might accomplish, that would be the one policy thing that I think would unlock this sort of expansion of CDMO operations. Because until then, a CDMO can put, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars of capex to build a facility without the ability to recognize revenue from it for years. Even if they get a customer committed to them, they're not going to see much money from it until FDA has been in to do that first inspection and then product begins manufacturing. So that's a huge bottleneck when it comes to CDMO economics. And that's something we had to educate Congress, FDA, and other parties about. I would love to see, like I say, pre-GMP certification would be a great way to incentivize domestic manufacturing from a CDMO perspective.
It's just so fascinating to think that if you think of all the things that could affect domestic drug manufacturing, that one of the biggest demands that the industry would make is we want more interaction with the regulators. We want earlier
Yeah.
interaction with the regulators. We want more inspection. It's
Yep.
just it would be not what you would expect.
Sure.
So it's just fascinating. And do you think there's a receptiveness to that proposal?
Potentially, it can happen. We really got this across to FDA at the beginning. We from the outset we tried to make this case with them, and they told us from the beginning, you need to go find a customer and then we'll come in and inspect. Over time, they've grown more understanding of what that pressure is like and what the pressures they're under to increase domestic manufacturing, seeing what role we can play. They get that there is this avenue to pursue. It's an issue of resources on their part and developing all the processes that will go into place, being able to go into a facility and say that we're looking at a shell. Here's what you need to build. Here's what we need to see to feel confident that this site will be able to manufacture up to GMP standards. We don't want to do anything that puts the public at risk, but FDA does get that there's a great possibility of being able to do something here. And they are more receptive to it than they've ever been. So fingers crossed, we'll see if PreCheck or some other program empowers that.
Fascinating. Well, Gil, I think we could talk all day, but with that, I think we'll wrap up. Thank you so much for talking to us today and sharing all these ideas with us.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.